Good morning. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today for the emerald ash borer informational meeting. We're having this meeting due to the recent detection of emerald ash borer in Pine and Renville counties. I'm Jonathan Ostis with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and I am the Emerald Ash Borer Technical Assistance Coordinator. And with me today, I have Danielle DeVito, who is the Plant Pest Regulatory Coordinator, and we're going to give you a broad overview of emerald ash borer. So just to show you the agenda, we're going to cover the life cycle, the host trees, how to recognize emerald ash borer itself, the signs and symptoms to look for, the known distribution in Minnesota at this time, the regulations associated with it, and the management options for dealing with it in communities. And lastly, I'll cover how to report new infestations, because we always rely on knowledgeable citizens throughout the state to report things when they find them. I am recording this meeting, so we will make it available following this meeting in the next day or two on our Emerald Ash Borer website. And so with that, we'll get started. And if you have any questions, feel free to just throw them into the chat as we go along. We'll either answer them as we go along, or we'll have time at the very end for questions and answers. So with that, I'm going to get started. And so just a little bit of background on emerald ash borer. It's a metallic wood-boring beetle. Its native range is kind of the Eastern Asia, so parts of China, South and North Korea, Russian Far East, parts of Mongolia, Japan, and Taiwan. That's its native range. It was found in North America in the Detroit, Michigan area and Windsor, Ontario in 2002 is when it was identified. And so it is thought that it was has been there since probably the early to mid 90s, and was likely brought in through via solid wood packaging material into the ports right there. And so it had about a decade of being undetected, and the populations grew. And by the time they discovered what was actually going on, there were thousands of dead and dying ash trees throughout the area, and lots of infested ash nursery stock. And firewood had been shipped out of that area, kind of kicking off that rapid spread of EAB throughout North America. So now we find emerald ash borer is known to be in 38 states and 5 Canadian provinces. It was identified in Minnesota first in 2009 in the South St. Anthony Park neighborhood of St. Paul. And now we're at 50 counties with known EAB infestations. So Pine and Renville represents number 49 and number 50. And so it's now been almost 15 years since it was first identified in the state, and it continues to spread. So the life cycle of this insect, it's important for kind of understanding how it works and for management. So the adult beetles are active. What we consider the active period is May through September. So that's the adult flight season. And so we typically reach emergence sometime in mid to late May or in June, depending how far north you are in the state. It really depends on how quickly things heat up in the spring. So we use what's called growing degree days to kind of monitor when we're going to reach initial emergence. So it can vary a little bit from year to year, but typically it's in late May. With how warm things have been this year, who knows what's in store for us in April and May. So it could be a little bit earlier. But on average, it's about late May to early June. So the adult beetles will begin emerging then, and what they do is a little bit of maturation feeding. So they do that for several days before they go and find a mate. They nibble on the leaves in the canopy of an ash tree. It's nothing that you notice with a naked eye. If you've ever seen something like Japanese beetle damage where they skeletonize the leaf, it's nothing like that. So they do that little bit of maturation feeding before they find a mate. Once they mate, the females begin laying eggs in the bark cracks and crevices in the ash tree. And so emerald ash borer begins infesting a tree in the mid to upper canopy. So they usually start laying their eggs in the branches between 2 to 6 inches in diameter, where that bark is transitioning from smooth to rough. And they typically begin laying their eggs on the south or southwest facing side of the tree first. So the side of the tree that gets the most amount of direct sunlight. A female beetle, on average, lays between 60 and 90 eggs in their lifetime. And so you can see how that population begins to grow quite quickly. So once those eggs are laid, it's within a week or two that those eggs hatch, and then the insect larva begins burrowing through the bark into the cambium layer, where it actually does the damage to the tree. So once the larva starts tunneling, it goes through what we call larval instars, which is basically just growing sizes or stages. And so they go through 4 growing sizes until they are done feeding, and then they chew a pupal chamber, which you can see in that center picture. And so they chew that pupal chamber about a 1/4 inch into the sapwood, or on really large mature ash trees with really thick bark, they will chew their pupal chamber in the bark as well. At that point, they're done feeding. And once they get to the next spring and summer, and when it heats up, they'll pupate and they'll turn to the adult beetle, and they'll start that process all over again. So what I just described there is a 1-year life cycle. In Minnesota, we have both a 1-year and a 2-year life cycle. So to kind of give you an example of that 2-year life cycle, emerald ash borer egg that was laid last year in the summer of 2023 made it partway through its larval development before going dormant for the winter. This spring and summer, the larva will complete its development and make its way to its pupal chamber. It'll overwinter a second time, and then in the summer of 2025, it'll emerge as an adult beetle. So what that means is we can have any immature stage of larva underneath the bark at any time of year. And that's important for things like transporting firewood and having stuff undetectable in the bark and emerging later. So that's how the life cycle works. Now I'll just, I briefly touched on it, how it actually kills trees. So it's the larva that does the damage to the cambium layer of the tree that really causes the tree mortality. So ash trees can handle a few insects tunneling around underneath the bark, but it's really once the number of emerald ash borer build up in a tree, that's when you start to get tree mortality. So it's really the strength in numbers thing. And eventually, and that's also why they start at the top of the tree and work their way down. If they were to start on the trunk of the tree, they would basically essentially girdle the tree much faster and not use the amount of living flow to its full potential and creating the most number of beetles. So that's why they start in the top and work their way down. And so what the big issue is with emerald ash borer, besides being very cryptic in nature, so it usually takes several years before you start to see any signs of infestation in a tree, is really you get the populations grow slowly at first, but then you start to hit this kind of exponential increase. And then once that population explodes, within a couple of years of that, you have tree mortality that comes up real quick, and you have a lot of trees dying in a very short amount of time. And this is a really hard thing to deal with if you're a community trying to manage a large number of trees on public property. It's just a lot of trees to deal with in a relatively short amount of time, and you end up having a lot of hazard trees in the environment that have to be dealt with, and it can be very expensive, and it can really break city budgets when it comes to forestry work. And if, as you can see, the sooner you find it and the sooner you start implementing management earlier on in that infestation, the more impact you're going to have on future population growth. So early detection is really key to setting up good management. All right, so host trees. It's all true ash. So anything in the Fraxinus species, and those have opposite branching. They have compound leaves and 5 to many leaflets. They have kind of that deep ridge diamond shaped furrowed bark. And so those are just examples of ash trees right there. A lot of cities will buy custom tree flagging and identify ash trees in city parks or along their main street to kind of bring attention to ash trees in their community and provide information on emerald ash borer. And so host trees in Minnesota, we have 3 types of native ash trees. We have black ash, which is what we have the most of, and that's found throughout 2/3 of the state. That's where the bulk of our ash resource really comes from, is in north central Minnesota, where we have huge swaths of black ash forest. Green ash is found throughout the entire state. It's the most commonly planted in right-of-ways and in yards and around people's homes and in shelter belts and in parks and things like that. And then we have pockets of white ash in the more upland areas and parts of the eastern part of the state, but it's also a common boulevard tree or planted tree in a landscaped area. And as you can see, all 3 of those species are highly susceptible to emerald ash borer. And so it really is about a 99% mortality rate. Minnesota has a little over 1 billion ash trees in the state, so we have the most amount of ash out of any other state in the U.S. And so it really is a huge resource. And often in communities, it's typically about 1 in 5 trees are an ash tree. And then as you get into certain parts of the state, that goes to 1 in every 3 or 1 in every 2 trees that are planted that are ash trees. So it really is going to impact every community throughout the state. I'll just mention too, there is a secondary host called the white fringe tree. It's like an ornamental shrub. It's not native to Minnesota, but you do occasionally see it planted. Emerald ash borer can complete its life cycle within the white fringe tree. It's in the olive family. It's not a preferred host, but EAB will go to it once all the other ash in the area are killed. So if you're looking for a new ornamental shrub to put in your yard, we just suggest not planting a white fringe tree. All right, so how to recognize emerald ash borer? There's a few ways, and really the best way to identify if you have emerald ash borer in the tree is by finding that S-shaped feeding gallery. So the larvae that are tunneling underneath the bark in that cambium layer create a very distinct tunneling pattern. And so it's the only insect in ash that will create that feeding pattern. And so you can see in that image in the top left, it has that nice tight S shape back and forth. That if you find that in an ash tree, you know you have emerald ash borer. So that's really the number one way that we usually identify emerald ash borer. Next, there is the emerald ash borer larva itself. So if you dig a larva out of an ash tree, usually you'll be able to see that feeding gallery shape. But if you have that insect larva, what's distinct about that is that there's two little spine-like projections. So in that photo on this slide, you can see it circled. There's two little black pincers at the tail end of the larva. So if you pull that out of an ash tree and it has those two little black pincers, you know it's emerald ash borer. That's the only insect larva in ash that'll have those two black pincers. We have native insects that have one of those or none of them, but if it has two, you know you have emerald ash borer. Next is the adult beetle itself. They are pretty easy to distinguish, but often you don't really come into contact with it because it's usually up in the canopy of the tree. As an area becomes more heavily infested, you might see them a little bit more, but in general, that's not usually what you find. But they are distinct looking. They're about a 1/2 inch long by about an 1/8 inch wide. They have those bright iridescent green wing covers and that kind of deep magenta colored abdomen. And so if you do find one, they are very distinct. And lastly, they do leave a D-shaped exit hole when exiting the tree. It's kind of the shape of the head as they leave the tree. They're only about an 1/8 inch wide, so this is really probably the worst thing to look for if you're trying to identify emerald ash borer in a tree. Usually, if you can see an exit hole at eye level, if you were to look up into the canopy of the tree, you would see a lot more damage that would let you know that that tree is infested. And especially on a large tree with thick bark, it's very hard to spot the D-shaped exit holes. If you do think you found one, if you have permission, it's best to peel back some of that bark to look for that S-shaped feeding gallery underneath. We do have other insects that will attack ash that leave oval-shaped holes that can look somewhat similar, so it can be often mistook. So really, you want to be looking for those S-shaped feeding galleries. And I'll tell you a little bit more here in just a few slides on where you're likely going to see that. And so here's just some of the common insects that are confused with emerald ash borer. Believe it or not, we have been sent cicadas and things like that. But the one that's most commonly confused in May and June is that 6-spotted tiger beetle in the bottom right. It also has that bright iridescent green color. It's a ground nesting beetle, so you see it running across your deck or your sidewalk or something like that. And people really notice them and think it's emerald ash borer. But if you see it on the ground, it's running, it's likely not emerald ash borer. So, all right. So signs and symptoms. So the number one thing that we depend on to spot emerald ash borer early is woodpecker feeding damage. So woodpeckers love to feed on the insect larvae underneath the bark, and they can let you know what's in the area once they find that food source. And so we really we look for what we call blonding. And so when woodpeckers are going after insect larvae underneath the bark, they will slough off some of the outer bark, creating what we call this blonde appearance. And so it's that color contrast of that bark being flecked off. And then within those blonded areas, you'll see these small dime-sized oval-shaped, kind of light-colored woodpeck holes. And so the blonding just tells you where to look. You still need to look closer for the actual woodpeck holes in those areas to know that they're actually going after an insect underneath the bark. And so when they're going after emerald ash borer, it ends up having kind of a distinct look because they're really shallow. They're just going deep enough to get to the insect larvae underneath that bark where with native insects that they'll go after and feed on, a lot of times will be deeper into the woods, so it'll create more of a shadow. And like I mentioned, emerald ash borer starts in the mid to upper canopy and works its way down. So if you only have woodpecker damage on the trunk of the tree and nothing in the canopy, that's a good sign that it might not be emerald ash borer as well. So those are all things to take into account. And so just to give you more examples of what that looks like, you have these blonde patches in these photos, and then you have these small dime-sized woodpeck holes within those blonded areas. And it helps to have good binoculars if you're looking up into the canopy of the tree. And oftentimes when woodpeckers are going after emerald ash borer, they will knock off enough bark in one location to where you can actually see part of the S-shaped feeding gallery on the surface of the wood. So that is really the number one way to look for emerald ash borer in a tree. In that center photo, you can see that's a black ash. It doesn't stick out as much just due to the color of the bark, but you can still see those marks. And then in that photo on the right side, you have a heavily infested green ash tree in a park where you're seeing that blonding and woodpecker damage going all the way down the trunk of the tree, and with the bark falling off at the base. And I got one question so far. So will you find the same indication on young ash trees? And what about ashes that are only 5 years old or so and don't have the same built-up bark structure? So young ash trees tend to be hit after the more mature ones right next to it, just because those are larger trees and they have more areas of phloem. But emerald ash borer can infest anything up to 1 inch in diameter. So they can get into pretty small stuff. You'll a lot of times see bark splits in those younger trees, which I'm going to go over here in a second. But you do see them infested. It's just you don't get quite the blondie doesn't stick out quite as much. And so here's some example of vertical bark splits. So when a tree is initially infested by emerald ash borer, the tree tries to heal around that feeding gallery, trying to cordon off that wound, and they build up callus tissue. And so as that tree continues to grow and that callus tissue builds, the bark separates from the surface of the wood where that insect larval tunneling occurred, and it creates a nice vertical split in the bark. And oftentimes you can see that S-shaped tunneling gallery on the surface of the wood in that open split right there. And so those are two examples right there. The one on the right, a little bit not as easy to see, but it is a type of split you will notice. And then here are some more examples of bark splits. That image on the left going all the way up the stem. You have lots of long vertical cracks, and if you were to be up close, you'd be able to see some of that S-shaped tunneling on the surface of the wood. And then just to kind of throw a little tricky image in there, that image on the right, you will see that if you look closely at the upper center of the photo, there's a split right there, and you can actually see a little bit of that S-shaped feeding gallery in that little split right there. All right, and then lastly, there's canopy thinning. So this often lags behind when we start to see bark splits and woodpecker feeding damage, but it is something that you will notice. So it's an overall thinning of the canopy. It's fewer leaves, smaller leaves, a lot more light penetrating through the canopy. And oftentimes what you'll see is that picture on the right there is where you get that really thin canopy on the outside, and you start to get a lot of epicormic sprouting along the main stem and lower part of the canopy on the inside. So you get real light and thin on the outside and real bushy along the main stem on the inside. And that's kind of a classic symptoms that you'll see on an infested tree. And if you were to look closely or look in the wintertime when the leaves are off, you would see bark splits and woodpecker damage throughout the canopy of the tree. All right, so symptom progression. So this is on average. This can occur faster or it can occur a little bit slower, but this is about average. As pest pressure really builds in an area after emerald ash borer has been present for a number of years, it can get down to maybe 3 or 4 years to kill a tree, but on average it's about 5 or 6. So in the first year of infestation, there are small larvae present. There's no outward signs on the tree that would let you know that it's infested. If it was an otherwise healthy tree, it would look perfectly fine. You wouldn't see any canopy impacts. You wouldn't have any woodpecker damage. In that second year of infestation, you have more emerald ash borer building up in that tree. If the woodpeckers found that food source, you might have a few pecks on a few branches up in the canopy of the tree. You'd have to be looking very closely and paying very close attention to spot it in that second year. It's really that third year of infestation that if you're paying attention, you'll be able to spot it. Right now, in March and April is really the best time to look for evidence of emerald ash borer in your tree when the leaves are off. So we do all of our survey activities in the winter months where we can get clear looks into the canopy, and we use binoculars to look for that woodpecker damage. And so in that third year of infestation, you have more emerald ash borer in that tree. You might have some bark splits. You likely have several branches with a number of locations with that blonding on the bark and with those dime-sized woodpeck holes, and where you can find a gallery. The canopy might be starting to decline a little bit, but the average person isn't going to really notice anything if it was an otherwise healthy tree before emerald ash borer started attacking it. It's really that year 4 of infestation where those canopy impacts become very apparent, and you start to have more more woodpecker damage, maybe coming down onto the trunk of the tree. It's much more obvious that that tree is sick and dying, and that's usually when homeowners notice that something's wrong with that tree. So that from that year 3 to year 4 is kind of when the cutoff of when that tree might be still treatable with insecticide if you want to save it, to where that tree is no longer treatable and will be dead within the next few years. And so, yeah, by years 5 and 6, that tree is dead and on its way out. It's going to be covered with woodpecker damage, and no canopy left. And it's important to note that ash trees dry out very quickly, and it become hazardous quite quickly. So if you have a large ash tree in your yard next to your home or your garage or something like that, you don't want to wait until it's completely dead to deal with it. That can greatly increase removal costs if you have to hire somebody to deal with that. So you really don't want to wait till that tree is fully dead if you're not going to treat the tree and that tree is infested. So plan to do the removals before that tree is completely dead if it's in an area that it could impact your home or your neighbor's home or something like that. You don't want to have to pay for crane equipment or things like that, which can double or triple the cost of that tree removal. All right, so distribution in Minnesota. So here's a picture of our emerald ash borer status map. This is available on our Minnesota Department of Ag emerald ash borer website. We try to keep it as up to date as possible. So what this shows you is we have a few different things. We have the quarantine counties, so where ash and emerald ash borer life stages and mulch and things and firewood are regulated. And then we have that green polygon layer, which is the generally infested layer. And so that's kind of key here. So we put a couple mile buffer around confirmed infested tree locations to try to better represent what's out there. So knowing that it takes 2 to 3 years to see signs of infestation in a tree, you're already behind what is actually out there and what you can physically see. And on average, the spread rate of emerald ash borer has been 1 to 2 miles a year of just natural flight, not including human assisted movement. So we're trying to better represent the area that is actually being impacted by emerald ash borer. So the best way to think about it is if you're in a generally infested area or nearby one, there's a good chance that your tree is already being impacted by emerald ash borer, whether you're seeing signs of infestation or not. And so you should be actively deciding how you're going to deal with it with the ash trees on your property, or if you're a city, you should be implementing management plans at that point. If you're in the general rule of thumb is if you're within about 10 to 15 miles of a known infestation and you don't want to lose your shade tree in your yard, that is a good time to begin treatment. And so I'll just zoom in here a little bit. You can enter your address. You can measure how far you are from known infestations. Just to zoom into what was found. So emerald ash borer was identified in southern part of Pine County, right along Highway 70 in Rock Creek, Minnesota. And so you can see there's also known infestations just a few miles to the south in Rush City, and then a number of miles to the north and west over in Kanabec County in the town of Quamba. So it's beginning to fill in that area. And so if you zoom in, you can see it's right on where the highway turns in Rock Creek there along I-70, just east of I-35. And as emerald ash borer insect pressure throughout the greater Twin Cities area is really high at this point. So things are changing pretty rapidly. So there's a lot of, if you're on the leading edge of infestation, things can change pretty rapidly within a year. Just to give a example of that, we did some survey in the North Branch area a little over a year ago and found no symptomatic trees. I went back there last week And much of the ash trees throughout town in that area are now showing signs of infestation. So once that pest pressure builds up, things can change pretty rapidly. Then the new detections in Renville County are right along Highway 212 in the town of Danube, so just west of the city of Olivia. And you can see that's kind of an isolated pocket. So, I mean, in general, in the southern part of the state, or emerald ash borer is being underreported. So there likely may be other areas or stuff that's going on. Just to zoom in a little bit, you can see we found, most trees throughout town there were starting to show signs of infestation. So, each point is just a tree that we confirmed, but we're just trying to represent a general area of where EAB activity is occurring. So there's a lot more trees than that are showing signs of infestation. All right, so that's our emerald ash borer status map and our known distribution. We're now going to move on to regulations, and I'm going to have Danielle chime in here.
Hello. Hi, my name is Danielle DeVito. I am the regulatory coordinator for the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. I'm the person you will talk to if you are a municipality, a tree care worker, city, anyone who wants to move anything, any of those kind of things, logging and stuff. I work with all of the regulations surrounding that with the quarantine. If you want to flip my slide for me, John, that'd be great. So what are quarantines, right? The initial placement of a quarantine is reducing the spread of a pest through the human-assisted movement. And when we place things into a quarantined area, it allows us to kind of immediately restrict any of that movement of a pest, but then people can work with me for agreements to continue their trade in those businesses that I mentioned as well. So in Minnesota, we have two different quarantines. One is our external quarantine. Under our emerald ash borer quarantine, there is a limit and a restriction to move any material that is regulated in from the boundaries. So it's that outside edge. No firewood, for instance, is allowed to enter from any of our borders without agreements from the Department of Ag. And then we have the internal quarantine. And that is how the state right now, we are regulating emerald ash borer, and we can quarantine just areas throughout the state as needed and as detections occur. So those are the two types that we currently have right now. In Minnesota, and I say regulated articles with emerald ash borer, what does that mean? He already showed that map. We'll probably reference it a few times here as well. When we look at this map, what is regulated? It means that all parts of an ash tree, the actual insect of the emerald ash borer, all mulch is regulated as well because of the mixed species. And then all firewood is regulated, meaning that it can't move out of that red quarantined area on that map without agreements with you as a business or as a person and us as the state of Minnesota Department of Agriculture. And so here's some more images of those things. Firewood is one that it is all firewood, not just ash. Again, mulch, all that mulch, because it can be mixed in with ash. And then that ash log, there's additional regulated. So those are the regulated articles that I mentioned that have rules on some of their movement. Here's kind of a busy map that I have right here too, as well. And I really like to just outline, kind of looking at it like a stoplight. Those quarantined areas are in red, and that I like the stop, don't move. That means if you wanted to move any of those regulated articles outside of those red areas, you can't do that without an agreement with the Department of Agriculture. If you needed to move across, we have that yellow arrow across the middle. That can only be done with no stops outside of regular traffic, like you need fuel or road construction or those kind of situations. And then green, what does green mean? What can we do with our green? You'll notice in the southeast part of the state, there's a long green arrow. That means items that are regulated can move around within a quarantine. They can freely move around within. And then we have one across that northwest corner of our state as well. And that green, things can move around freely with outside of the quarantine. A thing to note is outside the quarantine, all that material can move into a red quarantined area, but once it is there, it is then considered a regulated article. So I just really like to highlight when you go to that distribution quarantine map of ours, if it's red, you can't leave that area. I think that's really the big important message without an agreement with the Department of Agriculture. Flip to the next for me. Again, he mentioned that map that you can go on there and punch in your address, zoom in and out. The farther you zoom in, you can see more specific where some trees are, or zoom out. Really a visual learner myself, so I always, if you call and talk to me, I'm like, what county are you in? Where are you? And I definitely recommend people go right to the map, as our map is updated daily as well. So in the event that, maybe it's been a month and you're not sure, go to this map and you can look and see if there's been any quarantine additions as well. This is just a quick snapshot of our compliance agreement and what some of those things mean. We have that certified safe to move and a limited permit. That certified safe to move is someone that has been fully treated those products, some of our mulch and our firewood, that makes it safe to move throughout. And then also a limited permit is under a compliance agreement too. If you are logging or something, that limited permit is something that we work out, and it means that you can move untreated material only to a site that's going to treat, that already has an agreement. So those are some of the kind of options. And on here is what we call our treatment options. So under those compliance agreements, if you need to move material within your business, these are some of the options that we kind of work through with you to ensure that emerald ash borer is mitigated or treated, destroyed, so we're not causing any further spread of that pest. So if you want to flip over, and I mentioned firewood, I get a lot of calls and questions about firewood and what it means. So firewood, right there, it's defined, and this is defined as all hardwood that's less than 4 feet in length, and that's if it is split or not. So we have that rule because as wood is cut and split or gets smaller, it's easy for pieces of ash to sneak their way into a pile, or that firewood, it becomes all commingled, bark starts to dry, we can't identify from the grain maybe. There's lots of different factors. So that's why all hardwood, firewood, or all hardwood that's less than 4 feet in length is considered firewood if it's within those quarantined areas, or out, it is too. But so that's what the rules are and the restricted movement of those. So again, really just to drive home that what firewood can and can't do. We have that exterior quarantine, so firewood can't come from the other states. Firewood can't leave the emerald ash borer quarantined area unless it's certified. And then it can't leave the spongy moth. It says SM quarantine on there. Lake and Cook County, that's another pest, spongy moth, but firewood can't leave those areas either. What we can do, and think about that map with the stoplight, it can move around in that pest quarantine, move around outside of that pest quarantine. And then we see right there is our certified safe to move firewood seal. That is from a business that would be certified heat treated. And they are kilns that are heat treating firewood to ensure that all pests are treated and destroyed at a certain temperature. If you are going to be buying firewood, look for that certified safe to move seal at like your big retailers or gas stations, convenience stores, that kind of thing. That would it would be pest free. And really just to drive home that message I talked about, mixed firewood, just it's better to buy your firewood local and burn it local and not transport it great distance, because you never know. Here is my contact information. If you would like to take a little snapshot or something of that, or write any of that down. Like I mentioned, if you need to move wood, you're logging, a municipality, or any of those kind of questions about moving those things, please feel free to contact me, and I'm happy to walk you through our process and determine what kind of, and if you need compliance at all as well. I do see a message right there, and it says, how are ash products from Pine County moving into Wisconsin affected? That movement from a quarantine, all of Wisconsin, Wisconsin is not regulated for emerald ash borer, so ash products from Minnesota can freely move across into Wisconsin right there. It's a little different moving back this way because of that external quarantine. Feel free to give me a phone call after our meeting. I'd be happy to further discuss that regulation as well between those states. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Danielle. And all right. So just to drive that point home again, here's a picture of an ash log with no outward signs on the bark. You peel off that bark, you find that S-shaped tunneling gallery, but you still don't find an insect. Well, if you dig into that sapwood right there, you have a J larva just waiting to pupate and emerge as an adult beetle at a new location. So that's really why we drive home the point of don't move firewood and buy where you're going to burn it. Besides emerald ash borer, there's other pests and diseases you can spread by moving wood long distances. So really just get used to burning firewood where you're going to find firewood where you're going to burn it. So it's a good habit to get into. And this won't be the last forest pest that we deal with. So now I'm going to talk about management here quickly. And so I'm going to talk about management in communities. So in more like landscaped and managed areas, if you are a private woodland owner and could use some guidance on that, I really suggest reaching out to the Forest Stewardship Program to get some recommendations on management on wooded property. And so that's going to vary from what I'm going to talk about here, where we're talking about basically removals and insecticide treatments. All right, so we have best management practices for dealing with emerald ash borer. We recommend not doing work on ash trees, so doing removals or pruning of ash during that adult active period. So when those beetles are actively flying around, and we say that for a few reasons. Emerald ash borer will often reinfest the same tree it emerges from, and so or a tree right next to it. And so by waiting until the fall or winter to remove that tree, you're actually allowing more emerald ash borer to build up in that individual tree, and then you can remove it and destroy that wood over the winter time and reduce the amount of emerald ash borer in the area. If you remove that infested tree during the active period in the summertime when those beetles are up in the canopy and flying around, you're actually pushing those beetles out to new trees faster to kind of spread that infestation. You could have, if you have to move that wood waste to a new site to be processed, you could potentially be having emerald ash borer beetles emerging from that load of wood as you go down the highway to a new location. We understand that storms happen, and once you're in a community where you have a lot of really heavy infestation of emerald ash borer, you may be just on a time crunch just to deal with hazardous trees. So if you do have to do work on ash trees during the active period in the summertime, if you can leave that wood on site or at least chip it before you move it, or at the very least cover the load as you move it to wherever it's going to be processed. But ideally, you do that work October 1st through April 30th when those adult beetles are not actively flying around. All right, so basically there's two options. There's removals and insecticide treatments. And so with removals, if you're a community that has to manage a large number of ash trees, or on your property, if you planted a large number of ash trees, and there are areas where if they die and fall apart, they could cause damage. You can start reducing the number of ash trees on your properties before emerald ash borer arrives, before it begins impacting your tree. So remove the poor condition trees, the poorly sited trees, trees that are kind of at the end of their life. And then with removals, once emerald ash borer is found in a community, you can do targeted removals where you're identifying trees showing signs of infestation and targeting them for removal first. Then obviously you can you're dealing with dead trees that are now hazardous and need to be dealt with before they could potentially cause damage to property or injure humans. So those are kind of the three different types of removals that you can deal with. And treatments can be done preventively or they can be done therapeutically. So you can treat trees before emerald ash borer is known to be there, or you can treat trees after they are lightly infested. And so the general rule of thumb is that as long as the tree has no more than 30% canopy decline, that tree is still healthy enough to be treated and uptake that chemical and fully protect the tree. And so I'll get into more on the treatments here in just a few slides. All right. So removal or treatments, some things you need to think about when you're considering which option you'd like to do. How close is emerald ash borer known to be? Is it in my community? Is it in my county? Or is it a county over? How far away is it known to be? How healthy is the tree or the trees that you're dealing with? Are they in good condition? Are they worth saving? How large is the tree? Or is it a smaller tree? That would be easier to just cut down and get something new planted and growing? Or how many trees do you have to manage? So those are all questions that are coming to play whether you're deciding to do removal or treatment. I will say that emerald ash borer treatments are quite effective as long as it's applied properly and on a healthy enough tree. If you're a community that has to manage a large number of ash trees on public property, treatments are usually a pretty good option to deal with some of them. That way you can kind of manage the rate at which you have to remove trees on your public property. When you don't do any sort of treatments or like that, you end up having emerald ash borer build up and explode, and then you have a lot of trees die in a short amount of time, and it's really hard to deal with. And so that can help you manage that time frame. Otherwise, you can pick, if you have certain parks that are dominated by ash, or like a certain like main streets that you want to maintain the character of, those are also good places to do more like cosmetic treatments instead of management. Treatments do help reduce populations in a given area. So an untreated tree directly next to a treated tree is going to get some benefit from having that treated tree next to it, because any beetles that feed in the canopy of that tree are going to get a dose and die. And any larvae that are underneath the bark that are still tunneling are going to get a dose of that chemical and be killed as well. So it helps reduce populations in those immediate areas as well. So it really depends on the situation. With treatments, they are very effective. If you have a large mature tree that gives you lots of shade in the summertime, you could protect that tree for the next 20 plus years for the same amount it would cost to remove that tree. So it really depends on the situation. On average, the systemic insecticides that are available to treat ash trees typically run the average homeowner about $10 a diameter inch, or $7 to $10. It depends on where you're at in the state. But they have to be repeated, so it's not just a once and done thing. So depending on the chemical that you use, it either has to be reapplied every year or reapplied every other year. And so the main treatment option that's used by tree care professionals for large mature trees is typically the chemical emamectin benzoate. And so that's applied. It's a restricted use pesticide that you have to be a licensed pesticide applicator to apply. And you apply it via trunk injection method. So there's a pressurized system that injects the chemical directly into the tree to protect the tree. And that's guaranteed for 2 years before it has to be reapplied again. There are also soil drenches and things like that are available to the average homeowner. It's just important that you read the label and know that the chemical is rated for the size tree that you're applying the treatment to. And it's important to follow the label and apply it in the correct amount, because the label is the law. And those soil drenches are typically chemicals like imidacloprid, which are neonicotinoids. So you want to make sure you don't have any flowers planted right around the base of that tree, because those could affect pollinators, where the emamectin benzoate is not a neonicotinoid and it's pumped directly into the tree. So that's another benefit of that. In general, you just really want to make sure you measure your tree and know that you have the right type of chemical rated for your size tree. We really recommend having it professionally treated if you have a tree that's 15 inches in diameter at breast height or larger. If you really want to invest in protecting that tree, it's best to have an arborist take a look at it and make sure it's healthy enough and apply the treatment properly. So we do have the homeowner's guide to insecticide selection that kind of lays out all the different insecticide options that are available on our websites. And so if you want to go that route, we really suggest taking a look at that before you make your decisions. And in general, I'd just like to, management priorities change over time as you go from an uninfested area to a heavily infested area. So, you really want to be detecting and reporting infestations as early as possible. So on the lookout for it if you're not known to have EAB yet. If you're a community that's kind of on the edge of of the infested areas, you really want to be making sure you're doing some planning and have an inventory of all the trees that you're going to have to deal with. And that goes for homeowners too that have trees on their property. Take account of what you have and what you might have to deal with on your property. It's going to, be in your area sooner than later. And so you really, if you have your plan together and your inventory before it's found, you're in a much better situation than reacting once it's found. And so once you get into a generally infested situation, you want to treat high value trees. You want to remove and destroy the material on a timely basis. And then as that infestation progresses and it works its way through your community, you want to try to minimize the movement of wood and utilize it in whatever way possible in your area. And so lastly, I'm just going to mention reporting. We really depend on knowledgeable people that know what to look for. So now that you know what the signs and symptoms are, if you find it in your part of the state where it's not known to be yet, please let us know. And that can be done a number of ways, but really the main way is by using the Department of Ag's Report a Pest. We have an online form, an email, or a voicemail that you can contact to let us know of potential infestations. We just really would prefer if you can take pictures, so that really helps us respond in a much more timely fashion and know what might be going on. So if you can take pictures of the actual damage you're seeing, so the woodpecker damage, the tunneling of the insect itself, and notes on the exact location. So a street address or GPS coordinates if you have them. And that's the best thing to report. We can't really tell much if it's a zoomed out picture of just a crummy looking ash tree. So we really need to see those specific symptoms that you're seeing that makes you think they're infested, and we can follow up quickly. And so, yeah, those are the ways that you can report. And I just want to do one last plug here. We have free emerald ash borer field workshops that I'll be hosting in the month of March and the first week of April. We have 3 locations around the state. And so we hold these at sites where we have standing infested trees for people to look at. And so we talk for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then we look at examples of infested trees on site there to help you get familiar with what that looks like in early detection. So there's nothing like seeing it in person. So the registration for those are available on our MDA EAB website. We'll be holding them in Brainerd, Dilworth, which is right by Moorhead, Minnesota, and then down in Jordan, Minnesota, along the Minnesota River there. And so with that, we'll move on to questions here. All right. So yes, so the question is, will EAB only lay eggs on living trees, or do they lay eggs on dead ash wood? So they only lay eggs on living trees. Once that tree is cut down, you are not going to have any EAB eggs laid on that tree. So they will only attack standing living trees. Do you have any other questions? Once again, I'd just like to thank everybody for attending and great questions throughout the presentation. This is being recorded, and I will make it available as soon as I can. It'll be put up on YouTube. Oh, great question. Is there any grants available? So the DNR Community Forestry is the one that handles granting money out to communities to help manage emerald ash borer. They should have another round of grant money available at some point in the first half of this year. That is available on the DNR Community Forestry website. That's where it'll be posted. And that will, that can help pay for developing a emerald ash borer management plan, an ash inventory, and it can help pay for tree removals and replacements. So a lot of the grant funding goes towards tree removal, and then at least at the minimum a 1-to-1 tree replacement. And a lot of times it's anywhere between $100,000 to $500,000 that's available for those grants. And so those are grants that only public entities can apply for: cities, counties, soil and water conservation districts, things like that. Not for private property ash trees. Occasionally there is money available for that, so it all depends on what the terms of the grant is, though. So there was one round last year that allowed that to do work on private property for those that had met the financial requirements. The link to this meeting will be posted on the MDA EAB website. We will not email it out to everybody. Any other questions? Is there a sense of the primary method of human spread? Well, I mean, that's a lot of times it's things like infested firewood. I don't know if Danielle, you want to speak to that. We do often pick up EAB in much bigger jumps along major transportation corridors. So it's people moving infested wood, whether that's firewood or just brush material, things like that. But we also see it spread along rail lines as well. Showed up in the Moorhead area at a rail transfer yard. So, and there was a U of M paper a number of years ago that showed that EAB was spreading along rail lines in Iowa as well. So where people move, so does the beetle. It's kind of the general rule of thumb. And that's why we do a lot of early detection surveys in the wintertime, where we're going, on the leading edge of infestation, then along these major transportation corridors. We're going through these towns along there and along major rail lines as well, and we're surveying all the ash, in those small communities. We've picked up a number of new infestations that way over the last 2 years, and that's the way these two counties were fine from. We found them while MDA was performing survey in that way. All right. Well, if there's no more questions, thanks again for attending. If you do think of something later, feel free to reach out to us. Our email and numbers are right there. Happy to answer any questions if you think of more later. Thanks again for attending, and I'll make the link to this meeting available as soon as possible. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.